We are delighted to have Ambassador James F. Leonard, Director of the Aspen Institute Study of East-West Relations, with us this evening. In capsule form, the study's aim was to outline basic concepts to deal with East-West relations and to present practical recommendations. The study's advisory council consisted of representatives from 10 nations, including such people as Messrs. Trudeau, Smith, Barry, Kissinger, McNamara, and Vance. And I think as a special tribute to our speaker tonight, he had the representatives from 10 nations produce a document that's 28 pages long. The results of this important effort will be discussed by the director, Ambassador Leonard, this evening. Ambassador Leonard has had a lifelong career in the diplomatic field, including serving as a Foreign Service officer in Damascus, Moscow, Paris, and Taipei, followed by 4 years with the Arms Control and Disarmament Agency as Assistant Director and Ambassador of the U.S. delegation to the Geneva Disarmament Committee. Ambassador Leonard also served as Deputy Chief of the U.S. Mission to the UN and as President of the United Nations Association. He recently served as Deputy Special Negotiator to the Middle East peace negotiations before joining the Aspen Institute. It is a great pleasure to welcome Ambassador James F. Leonard to the Baltimore Council.
Thank you very much. That's admirable. And he threatened to read my entire curriculum, which would have perhaps more usefully used up the time than I will, but it really is a great pleasure to have this chance to speak to this audience. I've spent most of my life just a few miles away from you over here in Washington. I have many connections with Baltimore, a lot of family here, and just see it very, very seldom. And I must say it is staggering when you come here after a long time. And I'm particularly pleased to be able to speak in this place where we are right now, because anybody who comes up here, even if the speaker is absolutely abysmal, has had a worthwhile trip. It isn't a wasted effort. And I would thank the gentleman who provided the wine and the cheese. I hope I didn't get too much of either of them. We'll see as time goes on. I'm going to talk about this Aspen report, which I had the great pleasure of working with and for. It took us about 2 years to do the job. I'm not going to try to summarize the whole report. It really just doesn't lend itself to that. It's written very densely, as my very kind introducer said. To get into 28 pages what all these people wanted in there was really quite a feat. And the best compliment we got when it was all over was a friend who knows almost all of these people, worked himself in foreign affairs many years, and he said, "How in the hell did you get all those bastards to sign it?" It really doesn't matter what it was to get Helmut Schmidt and Jim Callahan and Vance and all of them. There were some I should acknowledge right away, including 1 or 2 of the ones that were mentioned, whom we didn't get to sign it. They had problems at the end. We can talk about that perhaps later. But by and large, the group that worked on the problem came up with the paper which you have there. Now, as I say, I'm not going to go through the details of it. The best I can do really is to pick out one major element of it and talk about that. But I'd like to try to give you at least an impression of what I think was the central concept that animated the people as they went to work with it and as they came out of the process at the end of the 2 years. I should also say that the explanation I'll be giving you is my own. I don't know that the words I'll use would be approved by all of the people who were involved in it. I really will try to be faithful to the spirit of it, but if I exaggerate and get off the track, then that's my responsibility, not that of the people who signed the report. I think it's fair to say the central concept of this report is that the U.S. and the West in general is faced with a dangerous opponent in the Soviet Union and its allies. They're hostile to us. And in fact, if we're honest, we'll acknowledge that we're hostile to them, to a lot of the Soviet government's outlook, the traditions it's inherited. At least, unfortunately, it chose the bad traditions, not the best ones from its predecessors. The whole social and political structure that they have. There's an awful lot wrong there. But the Soviet system is not going to go away. And I trust we aren't either. And in the face of that, there's just no choice but really to accept the fact of coexistence, whether we like it or not. It's sort of like people say about deterrence. It's not a theory, it's not a policy, it's just a fact of life. There it is. Now, this relationship really is bound to be rather dangerous, and we have to, it's our duty, I think, really, as Democrats, to oppose a lot of the things that the Soviet Union would like to see happen in the world. And I think we have to expect that they'll oppose a lot of the things that we would like to see happen. But there's another duty that goes along with that duty, to oppose the things that we think are bad. And that duty really is to stay cool, to be calm about the whole thing, to try to keep the dangers, these very real dangers, under control to the greatest degree possible. Always, especially in crises, try to take the greatest care about those. And always in all circumstances, and this I think is the central message of this, that this group wanted to put across. Always in every way try to find some way to moderate this antagonism, and over the long run see if we can't really reduce it. If there are two words that characterize their recommendations, it would be patience and restraint. And if there are two more words that would characterize it even better, it would be restraint and patience. Now, that's general philosophy. Okay, what about practical courses of action? What kind of lines of action did they come out with that derived from these general principles? Well, we looked for some kind of a phrase that would sort of epitomize this, and we came up with one that we called sustained engagement. And you'll find the phrase sustained engagement all through the book, those of you who are kind enough to look at it. Now, that's not a very catchy phrase. It's not exactly a slogan that's going to move the world, or a battle cry like 5440 or fight, that sort of thing. But it's perhaps well to be wary of battle cries, and that 5440 or fight ought to remind us we didn't get 5440 and we didn't fight. And I think that was probably a wise decision on the part of the U.S. way back then. So this sustained engagement, the group defined it, they gave it a lot of thought, and they defined it as an effort to persistently seek to multiply every possible point of contact between ourselves and the Soviet Union, between East and West generally. Be willing really to discuss anything. I think a lot of it might reflect the spirit of Kennedy's famous never negotiate in fear and never fear to negotiate. And I particularly underline that it seemed to this group to be unhealthy to be afraid of negotiations on the grounds that they're smarter than we are, they're better negotiators, and they're going to do us in. I just really don't think there's any foundation to that, and it's a very poor basis for a relationship. Now, multiplying points of contact, I'm going to talk mainly about arms control, but it means a lot more than that. It means also talking about political questions, talking about economic relations, encouraging trade if the trade is not going to be of military value to the Soviet Union, encouraging high-level contacts, encouraging middle-level contacts, and encouraging people-to-people contacts of every kind. And let me just give two specific instances, one unhappy and one happier, of this business of contacts. You'll recall not very long ago a U.S. officer, Major Nicholson, was murdered over in East Germany. And one of the consequences of that, certainly terrible affair, was that the U.S. War College, it's called the National Defense University now, but think of it as the War College, which was supposed to take its entire class over to the Soviet Union, then canceled the trip. Now, I think the murder of the major was absolutely reprehensible. But I think canceling the trip was an unfortunate outcome, and it really would have been better if the group had gone and all 200 or 400 or whatever there are of them had made it clear to every Soviet they came in contact with how they felt about that affair. I think that would have been a more effective consequence of the whole thing. On the other side, a very positive side, I'm sure that this Aspen group would be just delighted that a summit has now been arranged. And that would be true even if they are convinced that nothing was going to be achieved at that. I think it would be unreasonable, in fact, to expect great achievements from it. But it's nevertheless, overall, far better than not meeting. And if I can bring this business of context down into the Baltimore context, I haven't asked Frank about this, but I would hope that you people would invite the Soviets over to talk to you from time to time. Have you, in fact, had them over here? I hope you gave them a hard time. It wouldn't be right, really. Courteous, but tough. But I hope also that you left them with a feeling that the American people want better relations with them, if, in fact, that is the case here in Baltimore. Now, let me turn from these general principles to the area that I'd like to really focus on. It's the problem of nuclear weapons and this East-West nuclear relationship. I want to begin by talking about an old concept, one that was around a long time and never heard of anymore. It was thought up by a very brilliant man, also very fat, which unfortunately led to his premature death, named Herman Kahn. Some of you remember a book he wrote back about 1960 called On Thermonuclear War. And as he was writing that, when he was writing it, he introduced to the public a concept that he called the doomsday machine. He'd been watching the whole business of bombs, nuclear weapons getting bigger and bigger. You all recall that in the 50s we developed the H-bomb, and the H-bomb was maybe 1,000 times bigger than the A-bomb. And in fact, the H-bomb is one which doesn't have a theoretical upper limit to it. You can make it as big as you want. So he hypothesized that a country might build a doomsday machine, a bomb that was so big that if it was set off, it would destroy the planet totally. It would just turn it into little bits and pieces, maybe make a new asteroid belt going around the sun or something of that sort. And he wrote this up. He pointed out that if this were done by a government, it would ensure perfect deterrence, because no one would ever attack a country that had one of these set to go off. He imagined, maybe something like an automatic sprinkler system that you set a thermostat, and if you're hit by one nuclear weapon or 5 or whatever level you want to set the thermostat at, then the doomsday machine goes off, and that's the end of the affair. And knowing that, you're not going to be attacked. Well, he wrote it up, but long before he wrote the book. He wrote it up as a little paper and circulated it and got reactions to it. And he wrote it up in a very dispassionate, neutral way and sent it around to see what people thought of it. And he was surprised to find that the reactions were extremely negative. And they were especially negative from the professional military. Well, what was their objection? Why did they find, after all, if it's sort of pejorative to call something a doomsday machine, but if it really gives you perfect deterrence, what's wrong with it? Why shouldn't we have it if we can get it? Well, the comments that he got made it clear. The answer lies in careful analysis of that word perfect. And the best formulation of that is the one he put in his book. He said that most of these people, especially the professional military, pointed out that there is simply no way to get perfect controllability. After all, the military are the ones who discovered, or at least popularized, Murphy's Law. If something can go wrong, it's going to go wrong. And these people knew that no matter what kind of apparatus you set up to control this, it would be vulnerable to some kind of an accident. And the chance of an accident might be a very, very small chance, but it would be something greater than 0. And as Kahn put it, if there is a failure, if the machine's control system were to fail, then, in Kahn's words, a failure kills too many people and kills them too automatically. And that did it. That argument, it was reflected in comment after comment that he got, and he put it aside. Now that way of writing it up, a failure kills too many people and kills it too automatically, it's kind of cold understatement, but it got Kahn in trouble with a lot of liberals, but nevertheless, I think it's absolutely valid. He was really worried that what he called some colonel might think this was a good idea and actually get a classified project going to build a doomsday machine. And you know what would happen, it would get a little momentum and the defense contractors would get into it and we'd have a doomsday machine. But in fact there wasn't that kind of interest or support for it. Now, why do I bring that up at this point? Because that's 25 years ago when he actually published the book. Well, the reason is because actually starting a little bit before, about in the middle 50s, and going on all through the 60s and into the 70s, what the Soviet Union and the United States did really was to build not one, not two, but 4 doomsday machines. These are separate, but they're interrelated and even, I would say, interlocked. Now, what do I mean when I talk about 4 separate doomsday machines? Well, let me just describe briefly. Number 1, we call it the U.S. Strategic Deterrent. It has 1,000 ICBMs. It has most of them with multiple warheads. It has 35 nuclear submarines with some 600 missiles. It has a couple of hundred bombers. Altogether, there are about 8,000 missile warheads in that deterrent, and there are another 1,000 or so aircraft bombs, all of them ready to go. And then, doomsday machine number 2, obviously, to the Soviets, and like Avis, they're trying harder and maybe running faster, although there's some argument about that. They have 1,400 ICBMs with a great many warheads. They have 75 submarines against our 35 with 950 missiles on them, more than we have. They have not as many bombers as we, about 140. But it comes out really about another 8,000 warheads. And maybe 200-300 bombs on their bombers. And then there's number 3 and 4. Number 3 is what we used to call the U.S. theater nuclear forces. Then our European allies objected to that. They said they didn't like being called a theater because that sort of suggested we were spectators and wouldn't be part of the show if it went on. But I'm serious, that really was it. But anyway, these nuclear forces that are related to Europe, they contain another between 5,000 and 6,000 warheads. They're contained in artillery shells, they're in aircraft bombs, they're in missiles, both cruise missiles and ballistic missiles. They're in mines, they're in anti-aircraft shells. And the Soviets have machine number 4. It's the counterpart of ours. We don't really know nearly as much about it, but it's generally considered to be about the same size as ours, about another 5,000-6,000 warheads, maybe a few more. Now, I know these numbers are rather hard to relate to, but I'd like to try at this point a little audio-visual aid, which I think might make clear relate these numbers to something that we can perhaps have some feel for, namely World War II. A lot of us were at the age where we went through World War II, and we know that an awful lot of people got killed in World War II, maybe 20 million, maybe 30 million, something of that sort. And in the course of World War II, there was fired off altogether something on the order of 3 megatons of explosives. You know what megatons are. A million tons of TNT is one. The force of a million tons of TNT is 1 megaton. And in World War II, there were about 3 million tons. And if you'll excuse me, what I will do is represent that by this little device here. Which is, I say it's audio-visual. And what I'll do is take a BB, which I happen to have in my pocket, plain ordinary BB, and drop it like that. Now let's assume that that's the noise that was made by World War II. Then what would World War III sound like? Well, let me give you an idea. Would you be good enough to help me? My magician's assistant here is standing by to give me a hand at this. Now that isn't World War III. That's just a very small, limited nuclear war which is stopped the moment it gets started. That's maybe 20, 30, 50 megatons, something of that sort. Over in Europe, these theater nuclear forces I was talking about a moment ago. That's what that would be. Now let me show you what World War III really would be like. On the same scale, 1 BB is World War II. Ellie, you want to just hold that there? This is up a little higher. I know there are a few of them on the floor. I'm sorry, there are a few on the floor. We'll have to deal with that later. That's the same scale. Each BB is 3 megatons. There were 5,000 BBs there. We have about 15,000 megatons in the strategic arsenals of the U.S. and the Soviet Union. So that gives you an idea. And that, you know, if people say, is that really a doomsday machine? I think maybe that justifies the use of a phrase, a provocative, pejorative phrase of that sort. Also makes it very difficult for me to accept a comment that I saw the other day. It comes from a gentleman that I understand you had talking to you, John Lehman, Secretary of the Navy. He was recently gave a talk, and in the course of it he said the following, and let me read the whole paragraph. I'm sorry, it takes a little longer. I reject the view that somehow we are all poor, helpless souls struggling to survive in a universe dominated by the weapons themselves. Well, actually, I agree with that. But, next sentence. We have the nuclear weapons we have today because conscious, informed human beings over the past 30 years decided that these weapons would best meet the military requirements of our countries. Now, I really don't know what military requirement this corresponds to. And it's perhaps gives you an idea of why so many people in the wrong text. So many people in the arms control community were very upset by this whole business of nuclear winter. They didn't really need nuclear winter to be confident, to be really absolutely dead certain that a nuclear war would mean the end of civilization. And certainly in the northern hemisphere, there might be something survived down in New Zealand. But we don't need anything like those 15,000 megatons to wipe out whole countries at a time. Just, you know, you take them, something like, that would do Hungary or Belgium or you name it. And if I took a whole fistful of them, that would wipe out all of Europe, the good and the bad. So long before there was any kind of a nuclear winter, before the effects of all of these had its chance to work through the atmosphere and all of that, there just wouldn't be anything left of the world but rubble. And in fact, I think you can say when nuclear winter finally came, then you would have hell really frozen over. The Aspen group, as a group, were people who were very familiar with all these facts. They'd worked with this kind of stuff. McNamara, after all, had been, and Elliot Richardson had both been secretaries of defense, and they'd been responsible for seeing that this machine was in good working order and that the button was ready to go if somebody, the right man, pushed the button. In fact, one of our earliest meetings, McNamara really unbuttoned and told us about how horrified he was when he became Secretary of Defense and found out the magnitude of the American nuclear deterrent, and how he immediately had a series of conversations with Kennedy in which they clarified not when it would be pushed, but when it would not be pushed. The button, that is. So So the group as a whole gave this whole problem of nuclear war really concentrated, sustained attention, and they came up with 3 recommendations, which I'll try to summarize for you. First one, to pull back some of the nuclear weapons in Europe. Second, to effect important reductions in the level of the strategic deterrent without expecting that it was going to come down from this incredible level tomorrow or anything like tomorrow. And third, to try in every possible way to improve communication between East and West. Let me make just brief comments on each of these 3 recommendations. Why pull back these nuclear weapons in Europe? Well, the argument goes that the threat of first use of those weapons, which is our doctrine now, has kept peace over there. It's the longest peace that Europe's had since the peace that followed the Battle of Waterloo. But if deterrence fails, then too many people will be killed, and they will be killed too automatically. And the character of these deployments in Europe almost guarantees that any war over there, however it starts and whatever the objectives are, whatever part of Europe it begins in, would in fact go nuclear and go nuclear very quickly. In fact, our commander there, General Rogers, has been warning that it could be hours rather than days before when he would have to resort to nuclear weapons. So these weapons, the nuclear weapons in Europe, are in many cases right on the front lines, right on the east-west lines. They are artillery shells, which have a range of 10 or 20 miles at the most. They are mines, which have a 0 range. You have to put them right where you're going to set it off. They're anti-aircraft shells, which have to be fired when the plane comes over. You can't check with the president. And these are in the category that are called by the military, use them or lose them. If you're being driven backward and these things are up front, they're going to be overrun if they aren't shut off. So it is what I think it's fair to call a hair trigger. Moreover, in the judgment of this group, which I certainly strongly support, this kind of a deployment of these weapons is not necessary in order to deter a Soviet attack. The group agreed that a unilateral pullback of these weapons would in fact not be a favor to the Soviets. It would make us safer. It would make our European allies safer. Now that's not a radical proposal. It may sound radical when you talk about use the word unilateral. Right away you're sounding pretty radical. But in fact, the U.S. did decide to pull out 1,000 of these nuclear weapons in Europe back in 1979 and did so. And it decided in 1983 to pull out another 1,400 of them and is in the process of doing that now. So what the group really was urging was just that there be more of this, that it go more deeply and be pressed more vigorously, and that countercurrents toward improvement of these weapons in Europe should be resisted. And a typical countercurrent you find in the present defense budget right now. The money for a new artillery shell to replace the artillery shells which have been there now for 15, 20 years. These resources, in the opinion of this group certainly, should be put into improving NATO's conventional defense and in raising the nuclear threshold rather than pulling it down. The second area is the strategic forces. Here it has to be a negotiated cutback. It can't be unilateral. There are a whole variety of reasons for that. They urge that it begin promptly and that it go very deep, but they particularly underline the desirability of making these cuts in a way that would increase stability rather than diminish it. Make both sides less interested, less tempted by anything that might be called a preemptive attack, a first strike. It really should never look advantageous to either side, and in fact neither side should be able to even be suspicious that it looks advantageous to the other side to move first and preempt with these weapons. The whole motif that was underlined again and again is to enhance deterrence, not to undermine it. And that brings us, I'm afraid, to the Strategic Defense Initiative of President Reagan. This was discussed very intensively. Maybe we could talk about it a little afterward, but Let me just say that they took it very seriously. They looked at it very hard. They found the objective of making nuclear weapons, quote, impotent and obsolete, found the objective impossible of attainment, and they found the pursuit of this objective to be not only enormously costly, but actually dangerous. I say I'll leave it there. The language that you'll find, if any of you are good enough to read the report, is very restrained. These are all, in a sense, diplomats. But the feelings about the SDI on the part of the group were really very strong. The third area is this area of East-West communications. Again, they attach great importance to this. They thought of communications both in the technical sense, both things like the hotline, ways of being in closer touch in times of crisis, but also, and I think they would underline, political communications, things that can, if they are pursued and pursued successfully, make crises less likely. And I just note again how very warmly I think this group would applaud the recent decision on the part of Mr. Reagan and Mr. Gorbachev to get together in November. And I think they would have, even if nothing comes out of it, just as they would, I'm sure, have been very pleased at the recent working level talks that have gone on between the State Department and Soviet opposite numbers on the Middle East, on Afghanistan, and other issues, even if no agreements came out of those discussions. Well, this report called itself Past, Present, and Future, and talked mostly about the present. Let me just say a final word about the future. The antagonism that exists between us and the Soviets really is very deep-seated. And there's been, we called for improved management of the relations here. Well, we've had 40 years of what I think is pretty bad management of that relationship, with a few flashes of something really a good deal better, notably, I would say, during the Nixon-Kissinger period. But my conviction, and I think that's the group as a whole would share it, and probably share it very strongly, is just that, damn it, it doesn't have to be this way. The Soviets are difficult. They really are difficult. I've lived there a couple of years myself. They skillfully make enemies of the two groups that they should, above all, try to make friends out of, the diplomats who live there, and the press corps that also lives there and has to report on them. And they just make their lives miserable, and the results are obviously their own fault. But with all of that, they're human beings. As the saying goes, they put on their pants one leg at a time. And if we really work at it, if we really determine that we can do something about this, then I think it is possible to make things a lot better and a lot better. And in 15 or 20 years, maybe longer, but maybe if we're optimistic, something on that order, then we can affect some sort of a really basic improvement. If we do, the desirable outcome would be that our grandchildren would really wonder what all of this East-West fuss was about, what all the tension was over. They would look back at this period and they'd say, my God, you really had serious problems in the world then. And you were fooling around with that stuff. Now, what was that all about? Why didn't you really try to do something about the serious challenges? Well, I think it's a very good question, and I just hope there's some grandchildren around to ask it. Thank you.
Well, the Aspen Institute, even though it's mysterious, enjoys a marvelous reputation, of course, as an institution which proves the great joy of being thoughtful. And even though the subject matter is extraordinarily somber and serious, I think that Ambassador Leonard conducted an evening which for us was indeed both informative and thoughtful, and a great pleasure as well, and we're in his debt for the night.
Thank you very much.
That was indeed extraordinarily vivid.
Isn't that a